Lenin dies, and it's Joseph Stalin who becomes leader of the Soviet Union. But what if I told you there was another man, a man who would have become leader, who was in all probability supposed to? That's right, I'm of course talking about Yakov Sverdlov. He seems practically unknown nowadays, but he was basically Lenin's right-hand man. And when I say he was supposed to be leader, what I mean is he was on track to be, because he was essentially Stalin before Stalin. So who is this guy and what happened to him? Yakov Aaron Mikhailovich Sverdlov was born in 1885 to a Jewish family in Nizhny Novgorod, where his father worked as a craftsman. Around 1902, at the age of 16 or 17, he joined up with his city's Social Democrats, and upon the party split, went right to the Bolsheviks. By the time of the 1905 revolution, Sverdlov had become a prominent party organizer, helping set up a Bolshevik presence in the Urals, and heading the party's regional committee there. But after an arrest in 1906, he would spend most of the next decade in prison or internal exile. Coincidentally, Sverdlov and Stalin's careers came to overlap a lot at this point. They were both betrayed by the same double agent, ended up in exile in Siberia together, and even roomed together, were both elected in absentia to the Bolshevik Central Committee, and were both editors of the party newspaper, earning appreciation from Lenin. Yet with Sverdlov in the east and Lenin in the west, it seems they didn't actually meet in person until 1917. But Sverdlov nonetheless became one of his main lieutenants soon after. His connections to party members, his on-the-ground work, and his making of arrangements to secure lodging for those coming into the capital apparently led to Sverdlov having a genuine grassroots support within the party, propelling his upward momentum. And so placed in charge of the newly created Secretariat that April, he proved to have a knack for administration and logistics. The Secretariat quickly grew into the nexus for coordinating all manners of party activity. Meanwhile, Stalin worked underneath Sverdlov, learning the ins and outs of party organization through him. And actually, during the summer of 1917, when most of the Bolshevik leaders were in jail or hiding, it was Sverdlov that pretty much kept the party together, building up support in the capital, communicating with those on the ground, and organizing a party congress, along with Stalin, who oversaw the party newspaper. Thus, Sverdlov was crucial in turning the disparate, unprepared Bolshevik underground into a growing, systematized party. Sverdlov next had an active role in planning and preparing the Bolshevik seizure of power, being nicknamed the General Secretary of the October Insurrection by Trotsky. First off, he was perhaps the first and most ardent campaigner for Lenin's course of action, helping to engineer the famous October 10th meeting held in the apartment of one of his employees, where tentative approval for the insurrection was obtained. From there, he handled much of the logistical preparations, and on the night of the 24th, he signaled the start of the insurrection by sending the Bolshevik sailors into position. Afterwards, Sverdlov proved even more crucial in engineering the new regime, a quadrumvirate of Lenin, Sverdlov, Trotsky, and Stalin, roughly in that order, was given the authority to make emergency decisions for the party. And Sverdlov, with his encyclopedic memory of party members and organizations, was the lead on setting up the new government offices. Meanwhile, if you take virtually any crisis from this period, chances are Sverdlov was ardently backing Lenin, and the one responsible for the planning and execution. For example, Sverdlov divided the opposition by negotiating the Left-SR alliance, and he carried out the collapse of the Constituent Assembly. But perhaps most importantly, it was his careful management, control over debate, and subtle manipulating of party procedures that led to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk being narrowly approved. That's where his second job comes in, Master of the Soviet. As mentioned in the election series, the Soviet Central Executive was initially an important center of power and site of conflict between the Leninist wing and the other still quite viable opposition parties, and against the moderates in Lenin's own party, centered around Kamenev, the Soviet's first chairman. But crucially, in November 1917, Lenin gained the upper hand and installed Sverdlov as the new chairman. Effectively becoming the first president of Soviet Russia, he would play an indispensable role in consolidating Bolshevik rule thereafter. He wrote the mores as they were developing, defining how representation and speech would work. In the literal sense, he was one of the main framers of the first Soviet constitution, but more subtly, he introduced technical and bureaucratic regulations, which controlled discussions and filibustering, limited the lesser parties, and set the seat proportions going forward. With his quick thinking and commanding bass voice, Sverdlov had a way of dominating proceedings and shutting down dissenters, as we saw in the Stalin trial video. The People's Commissar Lunacharsky called him infinitely confident, recalling how when chaos broke out at the Constituent Assembly, Sverdlov calmly walked up to the podium, shoved an SR out of the way, and grabbed the bell right out of his hand, taking charge of the session. With his signature black leather jacket, he was soon nicknamed the Black Devil, an embodiment of the tough guy hard aesthetic the Bolsheviks sought to cultivate. Second, he was skilled at electioneering and politicking, both in terms of whipping up votes to the Soviet and in energetically growing the party. He created a network of emissaries to dispatch orders, and during the dark days of the Civil War, led efforts to revitalize Bolshevik strength in the provinces. And when that wasn't enough, he was behind some of the more dubious methods of stacking the vote in their favor, moving dates around, manipulating the proportions, fabricating delegates, and so on. He had a hand in the implementation of war communism and the conflict with local Soviets across the country. From all this combined, it was Yakov Sverdlov, more than anyone else, who masterminded the Soviet and molded it in the party's favor during that crucial first year after October. Now, if you've heard of Sverdlov outside of this channel, it's probably in connection to the execution of the Tsar and his family, an act for which Sverdlov is often accredited, sometimes with anti-Semitic undertones. The short version is that in April 1918, the former Tsar was moved to Yekaterinburg under Sverdlov's direction. Nicholas's physical safety was to be ensured, as in the long run, the Bolsheviks were arranging to hold a public trial for Nicholas in Moscow. However, a series of events made that unfeasible. Uprisings in the Urals caused alarm that Nicholas would soon be captured. Moscow closely monitored the situation. For example, the first week of July, Lenin met with the Urals military commissar, Philippe Goloshokin, and instructed him to remain in direct contact. Often it's assumed that Lenin gave the order here, or perhaps gave contingency plans, but it's not entirely clear. In either case, the following week, the Urals Executive Committee resolved that Nicholas would need to be executed and began making preparations, though alerting Moscow before proceeding. No direct order from Moscow commanding the execution has ever been discovered. If it did exist, this was probably by design, given the leadership was concerned with the optics of ordering the executions. But what we do know is this. On the 16th, with the direct line apparently not working, a telegram was sent not to Moscow, but to Petrograd, and then in Petrograd, Zinoviev sent a telegram to Moscow, alerting them that the agreed-upon trial, whatever that might mean, couldn't be delayed, which arrived around 9:22 p.m. Moscow time. Moscow then may or may not have replied. Some 40 years later, one of the Kremlin guards at the time would claim an order was sent, but that he had been instructed to have the copy and tape of the telegram destroyed. Then there's some more indirect evidence, such as a diary entry from Trotsky, written in 1935. Here, Trotsky recalls he was out of town at the time of the execution, but upon returning to Moscow, he questioned Sverdlov who had ordered it, and Sverdlov said the leaders in Moscow had. However, in addition to being an after-the-fact recollection, Trotsky's anecdote is contradicted by the Sovnarkom minutes, which indicate Trotsky was in Moscow on the 18th, the day the news was first reported. In any case, around 2 a.m., the execution was carried out, and then a telegram was sent to Moscow after. Sverdlov brought the news to the Soviet executive the next day, having the body approve the action, and then brought it to Sovnarkom, where Lenin and the others endorsed it as well. Though here they also elected to attribute the killing to the regional Soviet acting of its own accord, thus distancing themselves from it. Meanwhile, news of the killing spurred all kinds of rumors and theories, as well as anti-Semitic fervor, which members of the White Army latched onto. In particular, a British journalist and raging anti-Semite named Robert Wilton would claim baselessly that the Romanovs were murdered in an ancient Jewish ritual, that their heads were cut off and taken to Moscow, and that the act was ordered not by Lenin or anyone else, but orchestrated specifically by Sverdlov, the secret Jewish puppet master and Red Tsar of the regime. And this idea has fueled conspiracy theories ever since. As a result, Sverdlov in particular tends to be extra infamous for the executions, and a common fixation in all kinds of Jewish Bolshevik conspiracism, especially alongside the rehabilitation of the Tsar in the last few decades in Russia. Anyway, in late 1918, with both Stalin and Trotsky dispatched on various missions, and Lenin having been shot, Sverdlov was once again at the helm of day-to-day operations, and he certainly had his hands full. During these months, he would often personally process as many as 40, 50, even 60 reports per day, and held dozens of meetings. And if Lenin had died, it seems Sverdlov was firmly in position to become his replacement. In addition to leading the party in the legislature, he unprecedentedly took temporary charge of the executive too, raising eyebrows about this sudden consolidation of power. A brief behind-the-scenes power struggle appears to have been ramping up, but it proved moot when Lenin recovered. Immediately after the attempt against Lenin, Sverdlov led the party's response through the implementation of Red Terror. In the Don region, revolutionary and sectarian violence, revolts, and the Don Army's own acts of terror catalyzed a 6-week campaign of mass de-Cossacization, arguably constituting an act of genocide, ignited by an extermination order issued on January 24th. In March, Sverdlov oversaw the re-establishment of the Ukrainian Communist Party and began preparing for the 8th Party Congress. But this diligent work was perhaps his downfall. While returning to Moscow on March 8th, Sverdlov came down with a fever, probably having influenza. He tried to work through the illness, yet on the 16th, he was dead, at the age of 33. He was given the Soviets' first state funeral, held 2 days after his death on the anniversary of the Paris Commune. After laying in state in the House of Trade Unions, he was buried next to the Kremlin wall, an honor which only 12 people in total ever received. Lenin gave the eulogy, calling him a proletarian leader who did more than anybody to organize the working class and to ensure victory. And interestingly, this is one of the few speeches that Lenin committed to an audio recording. The sudden loss certainly left big shoes to fill. As Trotsky recalled, Sverdlov was truly irreplaceable, confident, courageous, firm, resourceful. He was the finest type of Bolshevik. Famously, when Lenin called him up with a problem, the reply was almost always, "Already done." Stalin called him one of the few people to be regarded among the lifeblood and true leaders of the revolutionary movement, the person who skillfully and painlessly resolved this organizational task of building a new Russia. The city of Yekaterinburg, where the Tsar had been killed, funny enough, was renamed in Sverdlov's honor, and actually the oblast still carries his name to this day. A bunch of other towns, ships, buildings, a university in Moscow all bared his name. As for filling the vacant positions, Lenin remarked it would be impossible for any one man to fill his shoes. In the end, Mikhail Kalinin was picked as the new president. Although, partially thanks to Sverdlov's efforts, the Soviet was hardly a separate locus of power at this point. The much more important position was management of the party, with its ballooning size making this a truly Herculean feat. It took the skill of a Sverdlov to keep it running, and arguably it brought him to an early grave. A number of people would try their hand at the leadership role, but all of them failed to keep up like Sverdlov did. Until finally, in April 1922, the job fell to Stalin, and where the others failed, he actually succeeded. Stalin's rise to power was on. Elsewhere, Sverdlov's family continued to have a minor presence in Soviet politics, being connected to at least 3 different people's commissars. Although the family was hit hard during the Great Purge, Sverdlov's son Andrei was an infamous investigator of the NKVD until he was arrested several times himself. Meanwhile, Sverdlov continued to be important in Soviet historical memory. He appeared in all sorts of romanticized historical paintings, commissioned and meticulously overseen by party leaders. In his namesake city especially, a whole industry popped up to meet demand. He was often placed alongside Lenin and Stalin, or depicted as the leader of the revolutionary movement in the Urals. See, unlike many of his peers, he never fell from grace. He died before any of the big intra-party fighting and denouncements. So of all the major leaders of the revolution, Sverdlov remained one of the only ones safe to actually depict, unlike, say, Trotsky, who people often confuse him for. So under Stalin's mythologization of the October Revolution, you of course gotta have Lenin, and then Stalin right next to him to reinforce the continuity between the two. But then, who else can you put? Might as well be Sverdlov. By the way, this artist also did a post-Stalin version too, which removes Stalin while keeping Sverdlov. Or here's a depiction of Stalin taking charge during the insurrection. Who's alongside him? Sverdlov, of course. Plus, throw in Uritsky and Dzerzhinsky, two people who also died young, so they aren't problematic either. The artist actually screwed up here by including Bubnov. At the time a Stalin ally, he would be denounced and executed 2 years later. Hence, notice how in the redo version, made by the same artist a couple years later, Bubnov's now gone. Another really well-crafted example is this one from 1929, depicting that October 10th meeting from earlier. Naturally, Lenin is central, and funny enough they kept his wig disguise in. Stalin also is shown right in the thick of it, cool, calm, and collected. But now, who should be next to them? We don't want to give any ideas here that anyone else is more senior than Stalin, so that's where Sverdlov comes in. And who should be close to them? Again, use Uritsky and Dzerzhinsky, since they're dead. Meanwhile, Kamenev and Zinoviev, two key leaders in this meeting, were falling out of power by 1929. Plus, they had the stain on their reputations that was voting against Lenin at this very meeting, which was often held over their heads. So notice how they're here, but way in the back, in the shadows. Now, what about Trotsky, who was also pretty important here? He's depicted in the most minimal way possible. You can't even see his face. At a time when scenes were being cut out of films to remove non-persons, Sverdlov is one of the only leaders to consistently feature on screen. In Sergei Eisenstein's October, for example, he's the one hyping up the soldiers beforehand and shoving his way to the podium at the end, as he was apparently known to do. Or in the film Lenin in 1918, Sverdlov features prominently as the cool guy hanging out with Lenin, laughing and cracking jokes. Later on in the film, Sverdlov takes charge in Lenin's absence, and in the de-Stalinization cut, he pretty much becomes the second most important character. Plus, he was even given a standalone film in 1940, a rare honor at the time, depicting him as the ideal old Bolshevik. In the film, he's doing feats of bravery, organizing the workers, fighting the corrupt authorities. They even dramatized the shove incident. That's right, the Soviet president is depicted as a badass. And then he has his martyr's death at the end, with Lenin right by his side. Now, who knows what would have actually happened if Sverdlov lived longer, but the argument he would have become the next leader is that he held the key positions that Stalin needed to hold when he became leader. He effectively was the first general secretary, which was the position crucial to Stalin's consolidation of power. So if Sverdlov hadn't have died, the position wouldn't have gone to Stalin. And theoretically, Sverdlov could have then used the office to consolidate control himself. So after all this, why isn't Sverdlov better known? Well, obviously dying young didn't help. Then there's an argument to be made that while Stalin and Sverdlov were publicly on good terms, they may not have been very close privately. Plus, in the late Stalin era, less and less emphasis was placed on anyone but Lenin and Stalin. So even these depictions began to dry up. He didn't write major ideological works like Lenin that could then be mass-produced and focused on. And in the West, the rivalry between Stalin and Trotsky has tended to dominate the conversation, to the detriment of those not involved in this later drama. And so, people don't consider Sverdlov, but they should. Even so-called Bolsheviks keep confusing him for Trotsky or Martov in the comment sections. But he was not them, and understanding his role is key to understanding the revolution and how it actually worked. Who knows what kind of impact he could have had if not for a flu, or if, say, it was Stalin who got sick instead. But in the end, it was Sverdlov who died, and Soviet history was forever changed.